Hey guys, Akio Murasaki here. Today we are going to be talking about Ghost of Yotei again and, believe it or not, Gamergate. Yes, in the year of our Lord 2025, we once again have to raise the topic of Gamergate, unfortunately, because the game journalists simply don't want to let go. So we need to go for this again. We have an article here from Slate, Ghost of Gamergate, a new video game sparked fury and accusations of wokeness in entertainment. But we've played this game before, and it's boring. Yeah, so we've now officially moved from PlayStation and Sucker Punch not publishing any of their sales numbers, so we still don't know how many copies of Ghost of Yotei were actually in total sold. We only have kind of rough analytics, which close, as far as I know, roughly under 2 million, but again, not confirmed numbers, just analytics and some expert opinions, but nothing concrete. Which is kind of surprising, because if the numbers were very high, then undoubtedly Sucker Punch would be incredibly proud, PlayStation would also be incredibly proud. And on top of this, we have some very bad promo running for the game. We have the PlayStation and Sucker Punch accounts posting things like grilling fish, like, I don't know, riding into the sunset with horses, and some journalists also trying to glaze the game hard by posting screenshots of like a zoom in on Atsu's eyes, which no one's gonna obviously see when you're playing from the third person perspective and seeing merely her back. And yeah, and the other thing is that I don't think people are, very much interested in grilling fish when they're playing as a samurai in medieval Japan, but I guess your mileage can vary. But now, as I said, the conversation has moved from kind of focusing more on the game and just attacking players for not liking the game because it's supposedly woke. Before we go to the article itself, a couple of words about Laura K. Dale, who that person is. It's funny and very ironic that Laura decided to bring Gamergate again, because Laura is somehow the very epitome of why people behind Gamergate were to some extent right. Of course, towards the end, it has actually devolved into a full-on harassment campaign against journalists, against some activists. But way before that, one of the major points of Gamergate was the alleged collusion between gaming press, hint, hint, and the game production, game studios, the entire gaming industry. To some extent, as far as I know, that collusion has been proven. However, game journalists as a whole banded together and decided to bury all of that, and instead of trying to meet the demands and the suspicions of players midway, instead they decided to double down and pretend that the problem in fact does not exist, and they are continuously being bullied and attacked by, I guess, right-wing gamers, trolls, etc., etc. That was basically the line of defense that the game journalists were using, and since then things have only gotten worse, unfortunately. And as I said, Laura is a perfect example of this weird nepotistic relationship. Here we have a couple of Twitter posts which kind of illustrate this quite well. Here we have Brad Glasgow writing about Laura K. Dale, who once threatened to unalive herself because Anita Sarkeesian, that name might ring a bell to you guys if you're kind of familiar with the whole feminism frequency and feminism gaming angle. So Anita Sarkeesian didn't like that Laura interviewed Total Biscuit, who unfortunately is not with us right anymore. And most recently failed at her Bioware writing gig, here specifically talking about Veilguard, Dragon Age the Veilguard, falls back on old faithful, whining about Gamergate 11 years after it started. Here we have another post from Christina Tasty. Don't forget, intentionally lied about lyrics in a Persona song for an entire article, yes. So Laura wrote an entire article in 2019 here about how Super Smash Bros. Ultimate Persona 5 DLC includes a disability slur in the song. It did not, actually. That was very likely just some misheard lyrics, which, you could have reached out to both Atlus, you could have reached out to Nintendo to confirm that this is really the case. If you're a journalist, I feel like that's kind of your responsibility, otherwise you're not really a good journalist. They could have done this, they have not done this. Instead, Kotaku decided to write an article, and here we are. Now that we kind of set the stage a little bit who Laura is as a person, let's get right into the article because I think it's interesting. To be fair, not all of the points are entirely wrong. Some of them make sense, but a lot of them really don't, and that's why we're going to go for the entire article here. So yeah, insightful analysis, not interested. Back in the summer of 2020, during the first year of COVID lockdowns, 2 first-party PlayStation games were released back-to-back. Just a month apart, we had Ghost of Tsushima, the the first Ghost of game, and The Last of Us Part 2 that a lot of gamers, hated a lot. Upon release, Ghost of Tsushima was pretty beloved by a specific right-wing culture war gamer crowd. Again, to just kind of go back these 11 years. We wouldn't be having any culture wars if game journalists decided to simply stick to writing about games and not writing about culture, writing about politics, writing about, feminism in gaming. We wouldn't have a culture war. But yes, now it's the fault of a specific right-wing culture war gamer crowd, who placed it on a pedestal specifically as a way to directly attack The Last of Us Part 2. I've seen parts of these conversations. I think there were many of them were completely separate. You had Ghost of Tsushima, which was an amazing game. Unfortunately, haven't played it yet, but I've seen several gameplays, I've seen several discussions and reviews about it. It's a really good game. Meanwhile, The Last of Us, and this is an interesting part of the article, let's kind of spare ourselves the whole Israel-Palestine conflict thing, but this part is interesting. The game's sin on release for many on the political right was that it took a series whose lead was previously a man and continued the story with one lead who was a lesbian and another whose appearance was deemed too masculine for these players to be attracted to her. I kind of like how this is both kind of a little bit true, but mostly untrue. This has absolutely nothing to do with politics. What the game did was that it had a very good storyline in the first game, in The Last of Us 1. It took that story and then decided that, we don't want to follow Joel's steps anymore. We don't want this father-daughter relationship anymore. Instead, we're going to have an angry lesbian. Yeah, apparently that was the angle. And here, what they say, whose appearance was deemed too masculine for these players to be attracted to her. No, you simply created a character who's so hyper-masculine, she no longer looks like a woman. Yeah, obviously, there were some people who would say, she is not sexy enough, but that is not the problem here. You basically created a character who's completely unrealistically masculine to the point she's no longer a woman. That was the core of the issue. On top, of course, of butchering the story of The Last of Us 1, but yeah, let's just take a completely different angle and let's just outright lie about it, because why not, right? Of course, we are, after all, game journalists. And of course, the game also featured a prominent transgender character, which further drew the ire of right-leaning gamers. And I kind of don't want to highlight this too much, but it's also true that Laura is also transgender. And I do notice that this is a thing among transgender game journalists to overemphasize this aspect of literally anything in gaming. So they basically look at gaming as is there a transgender character? Is there a non-binary character? Kind of like a gender non-conforming character? For whatever reason, they always focus on that. They don't focus on the quality of the game, on the story. Is the story coherent? No, they focus on the gender every single time. Ghost of Tsushima's tale of a male samurai solitary quest for revenge. Okay, that's fair. And now we have October 2025, and we have the sequel, Ghost of Yotei. And it's set afterwards, we have the story of Atsu, a young woman on a quest for revenge against the 6 people, the Yotei 6, responsible for slaughtering her family. And she's driven by fury and bloodlust. She embodies the identity of an onryo, a vengeful female spirit. I find it interesting that she says here, vengeful female spirit. I looked into onryo a little bit. Unfortunately, I'm not super familiar with that side of Japanese folklore, but onryo by definition don't need to be female, but many of them are. So I guess fair game here. And here's kind of ironically the problem. Ghost of Yotei at its core is a very similar game to Ghost of Tsushima. It is nearly identical actually. It changes very little, it changes a lot of the things on the surface, it adds a couple of things, but yeah, at its core is a very similar game, which is part of the problem and which is part of the reason why people are not really jumping onto it, right? It offers more combat tools, but, and this is again funny, but largely a mechanically similar adventure. Yeah, so why would you buy Ghost of Yotei when you can either continue playing Ghost of Tsushima or you can buy the director's cut, which from what I saw side by side looks as good as Ghost of Yotei on a standard PS5. What I'd argue is a more personally engaging main character. Why is that the case? Do you have any arguments? Why is Atsu's story more engaging? For Vengeance has more nuance to the twists and turns it takes along its way. I wouldn't really say so. I've seen a couple of gameplays, and what I can tell you straight away is that it's straight as an arrow. It doesn't really have twists and turns. It's a quest for vengeance. She has to eliminate, the Yotei 6. There are 6 of them. She goes one by one and tries to eliminate all of them. I don't think that's very nuanced. I'm sorry to say this. There is a bit about the ending, which is covered in the next paragraph. So what we have here, now the very same right-wing voices who held Ghost of Tsushima up as one of the best games ever made, when it helped their argument. Again, I don't think the argument has any standing here. There is no argument. It was simply a very good game. Seem to think Ghost of Yotei is a terrible video game with no redeeming qualities. You are not selling the game well. That is the entire problem. You are not trying to sell the game well. You are either showing subpar screenshots with poor, on performance mode or something, or you're showing mini games which really people do not care about, or hyper-realistic graphics, which you are probably not going to experience either, because you are, I know it might shock some people, playing the game. YouTube creators decried how woke politics ruined the game. I would disagree, as in I would agree with Laura here. I don't think it was primarily woke politics that ruined the game. There is a progressive agenda that's in the ending. Okay, so there is that the protagonist was changed to a woman for no good reason, which is true. What is the reason? Why did you change the protagonist? Why could you not continue with Jin Sakai? What was the problem there? We ignored that they made her ugly. They didn't. Actually, that is pretty funny. They didn't. It's one of the very few cases where they managed to recreate Erika Ishii almost perfectly, all the way down to the scar she had from her eyebrow piercing. Yes, they basically recreated her face 100%. Crazy how it's possible when you want to try, right? But then turns out it was and this is what Grum's Mark Karen wrote on Twitter. It was a woke-infested, assassination-loving, Antifa-supporting, lesbian-ending woke piece of slop after all. Okay, I have to give some justice to Laura here. There was one other post from Mark where he kind of gave a little more credit to Ghost of Yotei, where he admitted that the game has quality, but it's just not very interesting compared to Tsushima and compared to, you know, all the other games. But he did also write what she quotes here. Yes, he went on a rant here, and that is actually very typical of Grumps, which is one of the reasons why in the quote-unquote right-wing gamer crowd, not everything he says is being treated equally seriously. He very often jumps on something, he sees like his pattern recognitions goes hard, he sees something, and then he just jumps on it straight away, which is one of these cases. But you also need to ask the question, why is this the case that you have so many more modern games where you have kind of like you know, non-hetero relationships at the very end of the story? Why this is the case? This has not been the case in the past, is now more of the case with more of the PlayStation games. And the question is why, right? I think it's a fair question. It's a question that someone could eventually address, but unfortunately not Laura here. And continuing, many of the core arguments boil down to I don't believe a woman could murder a strong and combat-trained man. So one thing that is kind of was raised in one of the previous paragraphs that Atsu herself is no... Oh, I'm not sure if I should actually spoil this. Okay, I give you 5 seconds, guys. Spoiler alerts. Okay, so Atsu herself is not actually human anymore. She dies. And she becomes Onryo, the vengeful spirit, which would kind of explain how is she so incredibly strong and how, for instance, in the first fight, she actually dies, but then survives. She lives on because she's no longer a human being, she's a ghost. Which I guess kind of gets resolved later, but this is one of the, you know, story beats in Ghost of Yotei, which are very important, and kind of justify how is it possible that Atsu is so incredibly strong, you know, comparably to Jin Sakai from Ghost of Tsushima. But one thing I kind of find interesting here is that, oh, by the way, the performance of Erika Ishii is actually really good. I heard her voice acting. She's really, really good as a voice actress. Unfortunately, that's not something I can say about her outside of her voice acting, outside of her acting performance. Because here Laura writes, Ishii is outspokenly anti-fascist, as if that was a good thing. And honestly, this is much of an understatement. She's not merely outspokenly anti-fascist, she's incredibly aggressive and militant. You might like that, but I don't think a lot of people do. And what happened after the death of Charlie Kirk, for instance, a lot of people didn't really like the way she responded and the way she carries herself. So kind of going back a little bit to Gamergate and people being hyper aware about the politics around games, well, now it kind of backfires and people are not sold on the idea of a outspokenly anti-fascist person being in a game. They're just going to boycott it, and everyone has the right to. And this is funny. This isn't it's funny that they quote Dragon Age, the Veilguard here again. This isn't the first time this kind of attitude has followed Ishii's attachment to a game. Last year, there were one of the voice options for Rook, the lead character in Dragon Age, the Veilguard. The game was targeted with similar hate aimed at Ishii as well as anyone else non-cisgender involved in the game in any capacity. The game allowed the player to optionally have their character to be transgender and feature a party member who came out as non-binary during the course of the adventure. I kind of, and this paragraph sort of covers this. There is some right in this. There was no point at which you were forced to play as a transgender character. That was merely an option. On the other hand, if you have a world of magic where you can achieve essentially anything and you have necromancers even raising the dead, Please explain to me what is the point of being explicitly transgender as opposed to actually being the gender you wanted to since birth, or since you realized that you are actually the person of the opposite gender. What is the purpose of sticking to being specifically transgender in the story? Yeah, I really want to hear an explanation to this. So far, no one came up with a good idea. But yeah, it's kind of funny how they're glazing the fact that there was a non-binary character in the story. They're talking about Tash. Tash is probably one of the worst gender non-conforming characters I have seen in my entire life. I've read a lot of manga, watched a lot of animes, played quite some Japanese games. For instance, in Japanese fiction, it is a quite common, even trope, I would say, to have a gender non-conforming character, either to have a bishonen or have a femboy, even, you know, a man who cross-dresses. And you can basically see this in almost don't want to say every single story, but it's a very common trope in Japanese fiction. And it can be done very respectfully, but unfortunately that was not the case with the Veilguard. It was absolutely horrible. The way the non-binary character was portrayed, they were basically an angsty teen lashing out at everyone, lashing out at their parents. The way that they came out as non-binary resembled the way you would do it in current times, not in a medieval-esque fantasy setting, so it was not fitting the game at all. I'm not even going to mention how bad the story of the Veilguard was. The writing was absolutely atrocious, and despite that, Game Journalists gave this game a 9, a 10, Game of the Year, you know, absolutely the best game. Even though the gameplay was kind of mid, the graphics were good, the gameplay was mid, the representation was really bad, stereotypical, and frankly racist. And yeah, and apparently, yeah, now they're glazing it, and we have people like Laura, who is now complaining that right-wing gamers were not happy with Veilguard. A lot of other people who are not even right-wing were not happy with Veilguard. And just to kind of put it a little differently, I don't even think this is a political issue as much as it's a consistent, since Gamergate, since 2010s, it's a consistent need for some reason to stick politics into games, and regular people who are not even right-wing simply don't want this. Unfortunately, for Laura, this is not an acceptable perspective, and everyone who doesn't like it is a right-wing gamer, yes. As with Ghost of Yotei, you can see how flimsy these arguments are if you look at them for more than a moment. Well, I'm sorry, Laura, if you are picking the bottom of the barrel and then scraping it really hard, then yes, you will only find flimsy arguments. But as I mentioned before, the promotion of the game was really bad. Ghost of Yotei was very poorly promoted, poorly sold to people as a good game. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the main protagonist being female or not. It's that simply you are not selling the game to the public well enough. And it's also not a big step compared to Ghost of Tsushima, which is kind of the reason why people are not really interested. So yeah, you can go after Grumps, you can go after quote-unquote right-wing gamers, but that does not really change the problem, which is people are genuinely not interested in Ghost of Yotei. Deal with it. But anyway, and I find this one really funny, video game executives are unfortunately listening to this vocal minority of right-wing voices and allowing them to make boardrooms shy away from progressive themes. May I just remind everyone the absolute spectacle that was the anti-Hogwarts Legacy harassment that a lot of the streamers, a lot of VTubers, a lot of creators faced from, and I quote, progressive voices in the gaming community. But no, apparently the right-wing voices are the ones to be blamed for executives listening to them. That is absolutely not the case. Game journalists, gaming press, and game studios are working together. They're kind of praising each other, glazing the games, even though the public, who is not right-wing by the way, is just not really interested in the product. And it's unfortunately the gaming journalists and the activists who dictate what ends up in the games, which are, well, I mean, she puts it, progressive themes, which ends up in the games, which people are in the end simply not interested in it. It has nothing to do, with being cis, straight, able-bodied male protagonists. It really has nothing to do with politics whatsoever. It's simply about certain, how do I put it, certain themes being put into games. The majority of the people cannot relate to these themes. The people who, to some extent, can are probably not interested in these games. A lot of the games that are being targeted here are kind of more male-centric. You usually find a more, I'm just gonna say it, male audience, like Ghost of Tsushima, for instance. I don't think the game would be, by definition, super popular with female audiences. Of course, there are going to be some women, some female streamers who are interested in the game, but primarily the setting, the blood, the gore, everything about the game is kind of more targeting male gamers. I guess cis and straight, or I don't even know what the complaints here are at this point. So in the end, it comes down to Laura really targeting kind of like the bottom of the barrel, that one single voice, and a couple of very loud voices who you probably could identify as right-wing, even though they're probably not. And instead of just being fair about the game, it doesn't sell as much as you wanted. I'm sorry, Laura, it simply doesn't, and you need to get on with it a little bit, kind of, and maybe go back to writing a little better articles, because it's not even like, in the case of Laura, for instance, her articles are just inflammatory, okay? The rhetoric she uses, the lying she did in the past about Persona, the lyrics in the Smash Bros. Songs, and also the tweets she made, regarding her assumed misgendering towards other people. All of this is just clout chasing and has nothing to do with being a good journalist. And by being a good journalist, I don't even mean just writing extremely well, over the top analysis, but simply writing average articles that stick to the game and not try to, spin up yet another drama and go back to Gamergate, which is long gone. I'm sorry to say, Laura, you need to move on, is essentially what I want to say at the end of this video, and I see you guys in the next one. Mata ne!